Hey everybody, it's James from RocketBlocks today, and we're back with another expert interview debrief. Today we're joined by Ashwin Shetty, who has quite the background in management consulting. Ashwin has his MBA from INSEAD, and he has spent time at Bain, Towers Watson, Deloitte, and has most recently found an internal strategy role at Goldman. He's been based out of Dubai, London, and is currently out of Bangalore, and is just one of the many coaches available for personal practice on rocketblocks.me with a link down in the description. Ashwin, we're so happy to have you here with us, sharing a little bit about your expertise. I'm excited to ask you some general questions as well as get into a specific case that you've done for us recently. So welcome to the channel.
Thanks, James. Excited to be here too.
Awesome. So let me talk a little bit about your background first before diving into the case. So I mentioned at the top that you've been in 4 different consulting firms, I guess if you're including internal strategy at Goldman. So I said Bain, Deloitte, Towers Watson, as well as now internal strategy at Goldman. One thing I wanted to ask, based on your experience, can you talk a little bit about what's the difference in case interviews at some of these firms, or how might you prepare differently for a case interview at some of these different firms?
Yeah, that's a good question, James. And it's an apt question to ask me because I've been at different firms and also I'm in an internal strategy role. I would say, I think if I look at it, right, the MBB interviews, right, especially when I was at Bain, I was an interviewer at Bain, and also when I was applying, I did interview with Bain, right? What I found there was MBBs as well as Bain and top tier consulting firms are very particular in terms of the core consulting skill sets that they want to hire for, right? So big core consulting skill sets being problem solving, your communication skills, your ability to synthesize and communicate well in a client-friendly manner, and also your general comfort in terms of quantitative interpretation, quantitative analysis, right? And they had a very methodical approach to test these skills, right? And Bain, for example, did invest a lot in training interviewers in terms of how would they test these specific skill sets through a case interview setup, right? And I think that's what differentiated the Bain selection process compared to other firms, right? Because there was so much focus on training the interviewers, getting a standardized way of assessing candidates and getting the best of the best through the door. I think Bain was able to not only attract the best candidates, but also select those candidates who demonstrated good problem solving skills, great communication skills, and then who would go on further to become top tier consultants, right? I think that's the key difference, I would say. In terms of other consulting firms as Deloitte and Towers Watson, there was a focus in terms of selecting the best among the pool. However, the interviewers were not trained to test these abilities of candidates. Rather, it depended a lot on the interviewer. There was no standardized framework defined that this is how selection should happen, right? And neither there were standardized format in terms of, for example, in Bain, if you look at it, they have in first round, there will be these set of interviews. Second round, it will be, let's say, partner interviews, so many interviews. This kind of standardized framework was also lacking in a lot of other firms like Deloitte and Towers Watson that I worked in.
I love it. That's really helpful. So with that, let's actually switch and talk about the case interview, the mock case interview you did for us recently, in which you helped evaluate between opening an ice cream store and a bookstore on a hometown. So the video of this case is available and linked below, as well as the PDF of this case, which is available and linked below. So let's first take a look at your initial structuring and then come back and talk about that a little bit, where you can share a little bit about your thought process that went into that and what folks can learn from that specific structuring.
Now, to make an informed decision, I think we need to analyze these two options from both financial and non-financial perspectives. Let me start with the financial perspective, right? So in order to determine which option is more financially attractive, I think we need to look at the potential revenue, the potential cost, and the investment payback period to recoup the initial setup cost of 300K, right? So here, I think the business with the least payback period will be more financially attractive, right? So whichever of the two options has the least payback period, I think will be more financially attractive. Now, from potential revenue perspective, I think first we'll have to look at or analyze key revenue drivers, right? Revenue drivers would be one, town demographics. Now, bookshop will thrive in areas with higher college student populations. Ice cream parlors would thrive in areas where there are more families. Right? So it'll be interesting to evaluate which demographic is higher. So I think when this question is asked to me, right, James, the way I evaluated this particular problem is the way I would look at two strategic choices a company or a firm might need to make, right? And I would always refer to the objective that the company has or the client has, right? So always start with the client objective. Uh, because my view is consulting is about helping the client make quality strategic choices, right? And there are no right or wrong strategic choices. There are only choices that are either aligned or misaligned with the overall client objective. So getting clarity on the client objective typically serves as a North Star in determining which analysis you will need to conduct, right? Second, also getting a clear understanding of the core question is important. For example, in the case that I did, the core question was, should Michelle opt for a bookstore or should she open a ice cream parlor? Right, that's the core question. Then I went into the objective of Michelle, right, which was there is a financial objective. She wants to generate certain financial return, but more than that, she has certain non-financial objectives, which is she wants the business to be enjoyable, and she also wants it to be less stress, right? So the analysis that I developed, right, the problem structuring that I developed focused on these objectives. So first I started with the financial objective. And in terms of, I drew out what kind of financial analysis I will do to determine which option is more profitable, right? So essentially what I did was I broke it down into at the revenue level and at the cost level. And at the revenue level, I further identified what are the key influencing factors that might impact revenue. For example, for both these options, some of the key influencing factors that I identified were one, what is the customer demographic? What is the level of competition? What is the town weather, right? Because if you look at it in terms of customer demographic, if the town composed of more families with young children, there might be more ice cream sales. However, if it was a university town comprised of college-going students, a bookshop might thrive, right? So that's how I broke down the financial analysis in terms of which option will generate the most profit. Similarly, I also, when I looked at the cost analysis, I identified key cost categories, be it, let's say, the cost of goods sold, as well as other SG&A costs, for example, the rental cost, utility cost, etc. Right. Once I did the financial analysis, I also then looked at the non-financial analysis, which is which business is more enjoyable and which business is less stress-free for Michelle. When you say enjoyable as an objective, right? It's abstract, right? So I had to break it down into what concrete analysis I will need to do to determine which business is enjoyable. And that I did by identifying two sub criteria, which was one, alignment with Michelle's interests. So whichever business aligns more with Michelle's interests. For example, the case gave me information that she is interested in literature. So therefore, a bookstore would be more aligned with her passion. The other sub criteria I used was um, which business has what kind of customer interaction, right? For example, because Michelle is an ex-management consultant, I assume she might be more interested in customer interactions which were intellectually stimulating, right? So therefore, I used this kind of an analysis to determine from a non-financial objective standpoint, which business is most suited, right? And then driving the analysis was based on this initial problem structure framework.
That's awesome. One thing I really appreciate about this particular structure was that the question is straightforward. The question isn't like a complicated business case with multiple business units and international expansion. It's something that you or any candidate could understand right away. And I think it sort of underpins the importance of the structured analysis that you've done. It's saying like this level of thinking, this sort of problem solving that you talked about with Bain and with some of these other firms, this can be applied even in this somewhat straightforward question. You can take the same level of rigor and problem solving and apply it to this particular question and think through the objective, like you said up front. So I think it's super notable that, despite what feels like a fairly, accessible question, the same level of rigor is applicable and useful in this particular case.
That's a very good summary, James. That's exactly what I wanted to highlight in terms of the problem-solving structure that I laid out for this particular question.
That's awesome. We might also take a look at some of the chart analysis that you did. So if you've got a minute, we can actually just look at the chart analysis, and then I'm hoping you and I can talk about that a little bit to talk through how you look at some exhibits and data like that.
Based on this data that you have shared with me, and if I start with the ice cream parlor business, it seems to be a quite seasonal business. Sales increase significantly in summer and decrease in winter, right? And there are quite a few summer months over here. There are certain implications because of this seasonality. One, it will require more hiring of staff in the summer.
And we're back. So Ashwin, nice job analyzing that particular exhibit. One of the questions I have for you on an exhibit like this, or really any data exhibit that you might get during a case interview, is how do you think about switching between identifying some of what the data is saying, like, oh, there's a peak in December or peak in the summer, versus then translating that to insights that are helpful for the particular case?
Yeah, that's a good question, James. The way I typically analyze an exhibit, and that's how I coach candidates in terms of how they should approach exhibit interpretation, is first, they need to analyze the data and essentially get a sense of what the data is saying, right? That's the first step. But once they've looked at the data, next, I think they should contextualize this data in terms of what is the core question, overall core question of the case, and what question will this data help us answer, right? So if I look at the core question, what we're trying to do is that we're trying to determine which option out of the two businesses is a better fit for Michelle, right? And in a problem-solving structure framework, we also identify that we want a business which is less stress, which means it should have less operational workload, right? So once you've contextualized that, right, once you've brought that contextualization to this data, then you can start drawing insights. For example, once you have identified that we are looking for which business has less operational workload, you can draw some implications here, right? In the ice cream parlor business, there are more months, more summer months, in fact, where the operational workload will peak, right? And also, Michelle might need to adapt in terms of inventory, also and other operational requirements based on the seasonal fluctuations, right? That's an important insight, right? Which indicates that perhaps from an operational workload perspective, an ice cream parlor might demand more compared to a bookshop. Similarly, from a bookstore, what we see from the data, we see the sales is significantly peaking during holidays. It's November and December, right? So the operational workload might be more during the December month, but in ice cream parlor, it's more for a larger number of months, right? And finally, one implication you can also draw is you might need to ask which which holiday is preferable for Michelle? Is she somebody who enjoys taking a vacation during the summer months, or is she somebody who enjoys spending time with family, let's say, and spending the December holidays as a vacation, right? So that helps us answer the core question, right? So to summarize, James, first, look at what the data is telling you when you look at the exhibit. That's one. Second, contextualize the core question as well as the other information that you already know related to the case, and then draw implications based on that. All right. This is how I typically try to interpret the information in the exhibit. And just one point I just wanted to add here is that, especially when I was an interviewer at Bain, one key aspect is always emphasized is you need to test candidates from a multi-dimensional problem solving aspect. So what that meant was a candidate should not only analyze information in the exhibit, right? So it's not an isolated problem solving. He's just not looking at the information in the exhibit and drawing insights. He should also connect it to the overall case context. All the other information he has gained related to the core question, related to the case context, and then draw implications. All right? Because if you're drawing implications at that level, you are deriving insights that will help you answer the core question. I hope that helps, and it's insightful, James.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And it matches something I've heard from yourself and other experts as well, which is this idea of like, so what? Like, okay, here's a chart with a bunch of numbers and a bunch of graphs. Like your job as a candidate and eventually your job as a consultant is going to be to answer, so what? Here's a bunch of data,
Yes.
more data than, perhaps we can do anything with right now. And you're tasked with finding out, why does this matter? How does this influence the decision one way or the other? And I think what you did a great job of in this case was saying like, okay, here's exactly why this matters for Michelle. Here's how this is going to affect her decision one way or the other. And I think your point on from Bain's point of view, connecting that back to any other data that you have is the exact kind of like dot connecting structured problem solving that folks at Bain and other places are looking for. That's a really great point. Let's finish off today by looking at your synthesis section from this case and talking a bit about how you close cases out and what advice you have for candidates who are practicing this particular section of the case. So let's go ahead and take a look at that section now and then come back and talk about what went into your response.
Based on the analysis that we have conducted, I would recommend that Michelle open a bookstore. Now, this conclusion is driven by three key factors that I've identified, right? The first factor being, I believe bookstore business will be more enjoyable, primarily because it's more aligned to Michelle's background and passion. She has a background in literature, which indicates a natural affinity towards the book industry. Second, the operational demands of managing a bookstore business would be lower, and therefore it would be less stressful than managing an ice cream parlor business.
All right, Ashwin. So that was a strong recommendation to close out the case. One question I have for you, and honestly, all experts and all candidates when they come to the end like this, is how standard are your recommendations at the end, and how much do you tailor, say, the format or content of your recommendations in summary on a case-by-case basis?
Yeah, thanks, James. So in my view, in a recommendation, you should, one, provide a strong point of view, right? A recommendation cannot be the client can do X or the client can do Y, right? So you should have a point of view. You are paid as a consultant to provide your point of view, right? Then you have to provide rationale for your point of view, right? And in this case, because we're recommending one option, I've given rationale as to why I'm recommending a bookstore, right? For example, what I said is that the two key non-financial objectives of Michelle, that is enjoyable business and less stress. How does a bookstore business align with these two non-financial objectives? That's what I delve into in terms of rationale. The third rationale what I provide is both businesses are comparable from a financial performance standpoint. So although financial analysis is something that we have conducted, and also that was one of the objectives of Michelle, but because both the businesses are comparable in this regard, in terms of financial objective, our focus is more on which business is more geared towards meeting the other two non-financial objectives of Michelle, right? So that's how I have framed this particular recommendation. There might be certain cases where the recommendation will demand certain next steps from a perspective of, let's say, a detailed risk analysis, or next steps from a perspective of, let's say, implementation roadmap, right? For example, if the client is recommending, let's say, or if the client is asking us to recommend whether they should change their manufacturing location from, let's say, US to China, right? And let's say we have done a bunch of analysis which indicates that moving to China would satisfy some of the key client objectives. But at this step, it's important to also go into other sorts of risks that the client should maybe plan and mitigate for, right? For example, regulatory risk. There could be an element of political risk, and other risks that the client should also consider while making this particular decision. So to summarize, James, what I believe is that to an extent, you could tailor your recommendation and observe which a case question might require a more detailed risk analysis or more detailed implementation roadmap, right? And include that as part of your recommendation.
That totally makes sense. And I appreciate the difference in the sort of nuances and complexities there, as well as sort of the headline answer of like, you should have a recommendation. Like, this isn't the time for this or that. You should be choosing one specific option and recommending it. That's a really helpful and sharp piece of advice. So I appreciate you sharing that with us today. Ashwin, overall, thank you so much for sharing your expertise, both as part of this original mock video, then in terms of the advice you have for applying to different kinds of roles, as well as, kind of peeking behind the curtain a little bit here and sharing what went into some of your answers for this particular case. So thank you for being here with us today. Thanks for sharing your expertise. And for all of you out there in your journeys, hope you're having fun casing. So thanks a lot, and join us again for another video next week at RocketBlocks.